Master your emotions and don't let people control you. Someone disrespects you. Someone ignores you. Someone says something that stays in your head longer than it should. And just like that, without noticing, your mood shifts, your energy drops, your focus disappears. It feels immediate, almost automatic. Now stop for a second and look closer. Did they really control you, or did something inside you respond so fast that it felt like you had no choice? Most people never question this. They move from one emotional reaction to another as if it were part of life. A bad comment ruins the morning. A cold response creates anxiety. A small disagreement turns into hours of mental noise. And all of it feels justified because it feels real. But feeling real does not mean being true. This is where the illusion begins. You start believing that the outside world is constantly shaping your internal state. That people, situations, and circumstances are responsible for how you feel. And the more you believe this, the more power you give away without even noticing. Real control does not look like what most people think. It is not about dominating conversations, winning arguments, or forcing respect. Real control is internal. It is the ability to remain steady when everything around you is unstable. It is the ability to choose your response when your emotions are trying to choose for you. Right now, most people are not choosing. They are reacting. They are triggered by tone, affected by opinions, manipulated by attention, and pulled into emotional states that do not serve them. And over time, this becomes their normal. They begin to think that being emotionally unstable in response to the world is just how life works. It is not how life works. It is how conditioning works. Every reaction you repeat becomes a pattern. Every time you respond without awareness, you reinforce that pattern. And slowly, your mind learns that it does not need your permission to react. It just does it. Faster each time. Stronger each time. Until one day, you are no longer deciding how to feel. You are just experiencing whatever your environment triggers. But here's the truth that changes everything. No one controls your emotions unless you allow their actions to define your internal state. The control was never outside. It only felt that way because you were not aware of the moment it was taken. Once you see this clearly, you cannot go back. Because now the responsibility shifts. It is no longer about changing people, avoiding situations, or protecting yourself from discomfort. It is about mastering the one thing that has always been yours: your response. And if you can master that, you do not just handle life better. You become someone who cannot be easily shaken. Which brings us to something most people completely miss. The moment you lose control and don't even realize it, it never begins with chaos. It begins with something so small that it almost feels irrelevant. A subtle change in someone's tone. A message that arrives differently than you expected. A reaction that does not match what you had in mind. And in that exact moment, something shifts inside you quietly and without permission. You do not notice the shift right away. There is no alarm, no clear signal. But your mind has already started working. It begins to interpret, to fill in gaps, to create meaning where there may be none. You replay the moment. You analyze what was said. You question intentions. And while this is happening, your emotional state is already changing. Your body responds before you even understand why. Your breathing becomes slightly different. Your muscles tighten. Your focus drifts away from what actually matters. And now, without realizing it, you are no longer present. You are inside your own reaction. This is the moment where control is lost. Not when you speak, not when you argue, not when the situation escalates. It happens earlier, in silence, in the space between what happened and what you decided it meant. Epictetus made this distinction clear in his teachings. It is not events that disturb us, but the judgments we attach to them. The event is neutral. The meaning is created by you. And once that meaning is created, your emotions follow it as if it were truth. The problem is that this process happens so fast that most people never see it. They only notice the result. They feel irritated, anxious, frustrated, and they assume that the cause is external. But the real cause was the interpretation that happened seconds before. And because they do not see it, they cannot control it. So they try to fix things at the wrong moment. They try to calm down after they are already overwhelmed. They try to think clearly after their emotions have already taken over. And this is why it feels so difficult. They are trying to regain control after it has already been handed over. The shift begins when you start paying attention to that first internal movement, that first thought, that first interpretation, because that is where everything starts. If you can catch that moment, you create space. And in that space, something powerful happens. You are no longer forced to react. You are able to choose. And that changes everything. Because once you realize that the loss of control happens internally, a new question naturally emerges. If the control is not truly in other people's hands, why does it feel so convincing? The illusion of external power. It feels real. That is the most dangerous part of it. The idea that someone else can control how you feel does not just exist in your mind as a theory. It feels like a fact. Someone says something, and your emotional state shifts. Someone ignores you and your mind starts racing. Someone challenges you and your body reacts instantly. It feels direct, almost mechanical, as if their action created your reaction without any space in between. But that space exists. You just have not been trained to see it. From a very early stage, most people are conditioned to link their emotional state to external events. Approval makes you feel good. Rejection makes you feel bad. Recognition creates confidence. Criticism creates insecurity. Over time, this conditioning becomes so deeply ingrained that it stops being questioned. It becomes your default operating system. And this is where the illusion takes hold. You begin to believe that other people have access to your emotional control panel, that their words, their tone, their behavior can directly alter how you feel. And because it feels immediate, you assume it must be true. But what is really happening is more subtle. There is always an internal process between what happens and how you feel. A process of interpretation, evaluation, and meaning-making. It happens so quickly that it becomes invisible, but it is always there. Marcus Aurelius wrote in Meditations, Book 8, paragraph 47, that if you are distressed by anything external, the pain is not due to the thing itself, but to your estimate of it. And this is the part most people never fully grasp. The estimate is yours. The meaning is yours. The reaction is built from within. When you believe that control is external, you start behaving differently. You become more cautious, more reactive, more dependent on how others act. You try to manage people so that you can feel stable. You try to avoid situations that might trigger you. You try to control the environment because you believe the environment controls you, and this creates a fragile way of living. Because the outside world is unpredictable, people will say things you do not expect. Situations will not go your way. You will be misunderstood, ignored, challenged, and if your stability depends on those variables, then your state will always be unstable. The illusion of external power keeps you trapped in this cycle. You keep looking outward for the source of your emotional state, while the real mechanism is operating internally, unnoticed. Breaking this illusion is not about denying that people affect you. It is about understanding how they affect you. The effect is not direct. It is filtered through your perception, your beliefs, your past experiences, your expectations. And once you see that clearly, something shifts. The same situation that once triggered you starts to lose its intensity. The same words that once disturbed you begin to feel neutral, not because the world changed, but because your interpretation did. This is where control starts to return. But there is a deeper layer to this that most people still overlook. Even when they begin to understand that control is internal, they find themselves reacting the same way again and again, which raises a critical question. If you know it is internal, why does the reaction still happen automatically? The invisible addiction to reacting. You already know that the control is internal. At least on a rational level, it makes sense. You understand that people do not directly control your emotions. You understand that there is an interpretation happening inside you. And yet, even with that awareness, you still react. Quickly. Automatically. Almost as if you had no choice. This is where most people get confused. They think awareness alone should be enough to change their behavior. But what they are dealing with is not just a habit. It is a conditioned loop reinforced over time. And more importantly, it is addictive. Every emotional reaction gives you something, even the negative ones. When you get angry, you feel a sense of intensity. When you feel offended, you feel a sense of importance. When you argue, you feel a temporary sense of control. These emotional spikes create stimulation, and your brain begins to associate that stimulation with significance. So without realizing it, you start seeking it. You replay conversations in your head. You imagine responses you did not say. You anticipate conflict before it even happens. And when it finally does, your reaction feels justified, almost necessary. But beneath that justification, there is a deeper mechanism at work. Your mind has learned to crave reaction. Seneca described this in his writings when discussing anger. In On Anger, Book 1, he explains that anger is not just an impulse but something we often entertain and prolong. We do not simply experience it. We feed it. We revisit it. We allow it to grow because, in a strange way, it gives us energy, and this is the trap. Because the more you react, the more natural it feels, the faster it happens, the stronger it becomes, until your emotional responses are no longer conscious decisions but automatic patterns that run without your permission. This is why people say they do not want to react but still do. It is not a lack of intention. It is a loop that has been reinforced too many times. And breaking this loop requires something different. It requires you to stop feeding the reaction, not suppressing it, not fighting it, but refusing to give it the continuation it expects. When the thought appears, you do not engage with it. When the emotion rises, you do not amplify it. You observe it without adding more to it. At first, this feels unnatural. Your mind will try to pull you back into the Pravichnyi pattern. It will try to convince you that you need to respond, that you need to think about it, that you need to resolve it immediately. But you do not. The moment you stop feeding the reaction, something interesting happens. The intensity begins to fade, not instantly, but noticeably. And with that, you start to see that the reaction was not as powerful as it felt. It was sustained by your participation. And this realization changes the game. Because now it is no longer about controlling the emotion. It is about controlling your involvement with it. But there is another layer that makes this even more complex. If reacting drains you, and you know it does, why does part of you still enjoy it? The hidden pleasure in emotional drama. There is a part of this that most people do not want to admit. Reacting does not just drain you. It also stimulates you. It gives you something that, on a deeper level, feels engaging, almost satisfying. Think about it. How many times have you replayed a situation in your mind, not because you needed clarity, but because you felt pulled back into it? How many times have you imagined what you should have said, building better arguments, sharper responses, stronger comebacks? You tell yourself you are processing, but in reality you are reliving, and that reliving creates emotional intensity. Your mind does not always distinguish between positive and negative stimulation. It responds to intensity, conflict, tension, anticipation, frustration. All of these create a heightened state of awareness. Your body becomes alert. Your thoughts become sharp. Your attention narrows. And in that state, you feel engaged. That engagement can become addictive. This is why some people stay mentally attached to situations long after they are over. Not because they are looking for solutions, but because they are unconsciously feeding on the emotional charge. The drama becomes a source of stimulation in an otherwise routine mental environment. Seneca warned about this tendency in On Anger, Book 2, where he describes how people not only fall into anger, but willingly remain in it. They revisit it, justify it, and even take a certain pride in it, as if holding on to the emotion gives them a sense of identity or strength. But it does the opposite. Every time you return to that emotional loop, you reinforce it. You make it easier for your mind to go back there the next time. You train yourself to stay connected to what disturbs you, and slowly, without realizing it, you start needing it. Calm begins to feel unfamiliar. Neutrality feels boring. Silence feels empty. And so your mind looks for something to react to, something to interpret, something to turn into a story. This is where emotional drama becomes self-generated. You do not need someone to provoke you anymore. Your own thoughts are enough. A memory, a possibility, an imagined scenario, and suddenly your emotional state shifts again. And this is the real loss of control. Not when others affect you, but when you start affecting yourself in the same way. Breaking this pattern requires honesty. You have to recognize that part of you is attached to the intensity. That part of you is not just a victim of emotional reactions, but a participant in maintaining them. Once you see that clearly, you can begin to step back. You do not have to chase every thought. You do not have to engage with every feeling. You do not have to turn every situation into something bigger than it is. And when you stop feeding the drama, something unexpected happens. Your mind begins to settle. The need for constant emotional stimulation starts to weaken, and in that quieter state you gain something far more powerful than intensity. Clarity. But clarity depends on something even more fundamental, because before any emotion fully forms, before any reaction takes shape, there is a process happening so fast that most people never notice it. How your mind assigns meaning in the first place. The mechanism of instant interpretation. Before you feel anything, before the emotion takes shape, before the reaction becomes visible, something happens in a fraction of a second. Your mind assigns meaning. It looks at what just happened and immediately decides what it represents. Not carefully, not logically, but instantly. This process is so fast that it feels like the emotion came first, but it did not. The interpretation came first, and the emotion followed it. Someone does not respond to your message. The event is simple, almost empty, but your mind fills that space immediately. You start thinking they are ignoring you, that something is wrong, that it means something about you. And with that meaning, the emotion appears. Discomfort, anxiety, frustration. But notice what actually happened. The emotion was not caused by the event. It was caused by the interpretation of the event. This is happening constantly, in every interaction, in every situation. A tone of voice, a facial expression, a pause in conversation. Your mind is always translating raw information into meaning. And most of the time, it does it based on past experiences, assumptions, and unconscious patterns. Marcus Aurelius pointed directly to this in Meditations, Book 6, paragraph 52, when he emphasized that the mind can choose how to interpret any external impression. The impression arrives, but the meaning is assigned internally. The problem is that most people never question their first interpretation. They treat it as fact. If something feels like disrespect, it must be disrespect. If something feels like rejection, it must be rejection. And from there, the emotional chain reaction begins. But your first interpretation is often incomplete, biased, or simply wrong. It is built from fragments of information, filtered through your past, shaped by your expectations. And yet, you react to it as if it were absolute truth. This is where control is quietly lost again, because once the interpretation is accepted without question, the emotion becomes justified. And once the emotion is justified, the reaction feels necessary. Breaking this mechanism requires a pause that most people are not used to taking. A moment where you question the meaning before accepting it. What else could this mean? Is there another explanation? Am I reacting to what actually happened, or to the story I just created about it? These questions create distance, and in that distance, the automatic chain begins to weaken. You start to see that many of the things that once triggered you were never as solid as they felt. They were interpretations, not facts. And when you stop treating every interpretation as truth, your emotional stability begins to change. You react less. You observe more. You choose more carefully. But even with this awareness, there is another force that keeps pulling you back into reaction. Something deeper, more personal, and often hidden behind your desire to be accepted. The need for approval. The trap of seeking approval. There is a subtle dependency that shapes more of your emotional reactions than you realize. It is not always obvious. and it rarely presents itself as weakness. In fact, it often disguises itself as something positive. The desire to be liked, the need to be understood, the intention to maintain harmony. But beneath all of that, there is a deeper mechanism at work. You are measuring your value through the response of others. This is where the trap begins, because the moment your sense of stability depends on how others perceive you, you hand over control. Not directly, not consciously, but functionally. Their approval becomes a signal, their disapproval becomes a threat. And without noticing, your emotional state starts to fluctuate based on something you do not control. A delayed reply feels like rejection. A neutral tone feels like distance. A disagreement feels like a personal attack. And suddenly, your mind is not focused on reality. It is focused on restoring approval. You start adjusting your behavior. You soften your words not because it is necessary but because you want to be accepted. You overthink your responses not because the situation demands it, but because you want to avoid negative perception. You hesitate, you filter, you adapt. And all of this creates internal tension, because now you are no longer acting from clarity, you are acting from dependency. Epictetus addressed this directly in his teachings when he emphasized that if you seek things outside your control, you will inevitably become disturbed. And approval is one of the most unstable external factors you can rely on. It changes constantly. It depends on other people's moods, expectations, insecurities, and perceptions. Trying to secure it is like trying to stabilize something that was never stable to begin with. This is why the need for approval leads to emotional vulnerability, because every interaction becomes loaded. Every response carries weight. Every silence becomes meaningful. And your mind begins to scan for signals, constantly evaluating where you stand. But here is the shift that most people resist. You do not need to eliminate your desire to connect with others. You need to remove your dependence on their validation. There is a difference. Connection is natural. Approval is optional. When you confuse the two, you lose yourself in the process of trying to maintain both. When you separate them, something changes internally. You can engage without needing a specific outcome. You can speak without needing agreement. You can act without waiting for validation. And in that state, your emotional balance becomes much more stable, because now, your internal state is not tied to external reactions. But reaching that level requires something that most people misunderstand and often avoid. A tool that seems passive on the surface, but carries a level of control that few people truly master. Silence. Silence. As a strategic form of power. Most people misunderstand silence. They see it as weakness, as hesitation, as a lack of response. They assume that if you are not reacting, you are being passive. But in reality, silence, when used with awareness, is one of the highest forms of control you can develop. Because silence creates space. And in that space, you are no longer being pulled by impulse. Think about how quickly people respond. Someone says something, and within seconds there is a reaction. Words come out, tone changes, emotions rise. It happens so fast that there is no room for choice. It is automatic. And that automatic response is where control is lost. Silence interrupts that pattern. When you choose not to react immediately, you are not avoiding the situation. You are stepping out of the automatic loop. You are creating a gap between stimulus and response, and in that gap, something powerful becomes available. Awareness. Seneca emphasized this in On Anger, Book 2, when he described the importance of delay. He explained that the greatest remedy for emotional disturbance is time, not because time solves the situation, but because it allows the intensity of the initial reaction to fade, making space for reason to return. Silence gives you that time. It allows the emotional wave to pass without carrying you with it. It prevents you from saying something that does not align with who you want to be. It protects you from reinforcing patterns that weaken your control. But there is another layer to this. Silence also changes how others perceive you. When you do not react immediately, you become unpredictable. You are no longer easy to read, easy to provoke, or easy to manipulate. People expect reactions. They expect emotional feedback. And when it does not come, the dynamic shifts. The person who remains composed while others are reacting gains an invisible form of authority, not because they dominate the situation, but because they are not controlled by it. Marcus Aurelius reflected this idea in Meditations, Book 4, Paragraph 3, when he reminded himself that the best response to external disturbances is to remain unmoved internally, not indifferent but steady. This steadiness is what silence protects. But silence is not about staying quiet forever. It is about choosing when and how to respond. It is about making sure that when you do speak, your words come from clarity, not from reaction. And that distinction changes everything, because once you stop reacting instantly, you begin to notice something else. The very first thought that appears after a trigger. And that thought, more than anything else, determines what happens next. Reprogramming the first thought. Everything begins with the first thought. Not the reaction you show, not the words you say, but the initial interpretation that appears in your mind the moment something happens. It is fast, automatic, and usually unquestioned. And because it is so quick, most people assume it is accurate. It is not. That first thought is often shaped by past experiences, insecurities, expectations, and emotional patterns you have repeated over time. It is not a clear reading of reality. It is a prediction based on what your mind is used to seeing. Someone speaks in a neutral tone, and your first thought says something is wrong. Someone disagrees with you, and your first thought says you are being challenged or disrespected. Someone pulls away, and your first thought says you are being rejected. And from that single thought, everything unfolds. Your body reacts. Your emotions rise. Your behavior shifts. And all of it is built on something that was never verified, just accepted. Epictetus made this distinction precise in his teachings when he explained that impressions arrive automatically, but what we do with them is where control exists. The first thought may appear without your permission, but the second thought is a choice. And that is where reprogramming begins. You do not need to stop the first thought from appearing. Trying to block it only creates more tension. What you need is to intercept it before it turns into belief. The moment that thought appears, you question it. Is this the only possible interpretation? What evidence do I actually have? Am I reacting to reality or to a pattern I have repeated before? These questions create distance, and in that distance, the automatic chain starts to weaken. At first, this feels unnatural. Your mind will try to defend the first thought. It will try to convince you that it is right, that it is justified, that you should trust it. But with repetition, something changes. You begin to see that many of your first thoughts are exaggerated, incomplete, or simply incorrect. And once you see that, you stop treating them as commands. Instead of reacting, you pause. Instead of assuming, you observe. Instead of escalating, you stabilize. Marcus Aurelius reflected this discipline in Meditations, Book 8, Paragraph 49, where he reminded himself to remove unnecessary judgments and see things as they are, not as they appear through emotional filters, but as they exist in reality. This is not suppression. This is precision. You are not ignoring your thoughts. You are refining them. And as you refine your thoughts, your emotional responses begin to change naturally. They become less intense, less frequent, less automatic. But there is another level to this control, because even when you can manage your thoughts, there are situations where the environment itself is difficult, where people behave in ways that would normally pull you in. And in those moments, you need something more than awareness. You need detachment. Strategic detachment in difficult relationships. There are situations where awareness alone is not enough. You understand your thoughts, you question your interpretations, you delay your reactions, and still, certain people or environments seem to pull something out of you. Not because you are weak, but because proximity creates pressure. This is where most people make a critical mistake. They believe that staying emotionally involved is necessary to maintain connection. They think that caring requires reacting, that engagement requires emotional investment, that if they do not feel everything, they are being distant or cold. But that is not connection. That is entanglement. Strategic detachment is not about withdrawing from people. It is about separating your internal state from their behavior. You can be present without absorbing. You can listen without internalizing. You can engage without losing your center. This is a skill, and like any skill, it requires practice. When someone behaves in a way that would normally trigger you, the instinct is to step into the emotion, to match their tone, to respond with the same intensity, to defend, to explain, to react. But detachment introduces a different approach. You stay aware of what is happening, but you do not let it define your internal state. You observe their behavior as information, not as something that requires an emotional response. You recognize patterns without becoming part of them. You allow the situation to exist without letting it dictate how you feel. Epictetus reinforced this idea when he taught that you should not try to control what is outside of you, but instead focus entirely on what is within your control. Other people's actions belong to them. Your response belongs to you. And when you truly apply this, something shifts. You stop taking things personally. Not because nothing matters, but because you understand that most behaviors are reflections of others, not judgments about you. Their tone, their attitude, their reactions often come from their own internal state, not from your worth. This realization creates distance. Not physical distance, but psychological distance. A space where you can remain steady even when the situation is not. And in that space, you gain something that most people never develop. Consistency. You are no longer stable only when things go well. You are stable regardless of what happens around you. Marcus Aurelius described this mindset in Meditations, Book 7, paragraph 68, where he reminded himself to remain like a rock against which the waves break, standing firm while the turbulence passes. That firmness is not rigidity. It is control. But detachment alone is not enough if you continue to invest your energy in the wrong places. Because attention and emotion are resources, and most people are constantly giving them away without realizing the cost. Which leads to something even more practical and often overlooked. Where your energy is going. The energy you should never give away. Your attention is not neutral. Your emotional energy is not unlimited. Every time you focus on something, every time you engage mentally or emotionally, you are investing a resource that directly shapes your internal state. And most people are spending that resource without any awareness of the cost. You think you are just thinking about a situation. You think you are just replaying a conversation. You think you are just reacting for a moment. But what you are actually doing is feeding something that grows stronger every time you give it your energy. The more attention you give to something, the more important it becomes in your mind. A small comment turns into a significant issue. A minor disagreement becomes something you carry for hours. A simple misunderstanding evolves into a narrative that affects your mood, your behavior, and your perception of everything else. And all of this happens because you keep giving it energy. Marcus Aurelius reflected this principle in Meditations, Book 4, paragraph 3, when he reminded himself that the mind becomes colored by its thoughts. What you focus on repeatedly begins to define your internal reality. This is not abstract. This is practical. If you keep directing your attention toward things that disturb you, you are strengthening your sensitivity to them. You are training your mind to prioritize what destabilizes you. And over time, even smaller triggers will start to feel significant. This is how people become emotionally reactive without understanding why. It is not just what happens to them. It is what they continuously feed. So the shift is simple in concept, but difficult in execution. You stop giving energy to what does not deserve it. Not by forcing yourself to ignore everything, but by becoming selective. You ask yourself, does this deserve my attention? Does this situation require my emotional involvement? Is this something that will matter beyond this moment? If the answer is no, you withdraw your energy. At first, your mind will resist. It will try to pull you back into the loop. It will tell you that you need to think about it, that you need to resolve it, that you need to engage. But with practice, you begin to see that most of these impulses are unnecessary. You realize that many of the things that once consumed your energy were never worth it. And as you reclaim that energy, something changes. Your mind becomes quieter. Your focus becomes sharper. Your emotional state becomes more stable. Because now you are no longer scattering your attention across everything that happens around you. You are directing it with intention. Seneca pointed to this discipline when he warned against wasting mental energy on trivial matters, emphasizing that the quality of your life is shaped by what you choose to engage with. And once you begin to manage your energy, you start to notice another powerful factor that most people completely overlook. Your body. The role of the body in controlling the mind. Most people try to control their emotions only through thought. They analyze, they question, they reinterpret, they attempt to think their way out of how they feel. And while that has value, it ignores something fundamental. Your mind does not operate in isolation. It is constantly influenced by your body. Before a thought becomes clear, your body has already reacted. Your breathing changes. Your posture shifts. Your muscles tighten. Your nervous system moves into a state of alert. And from that physical state, your thoughts begin to align with what your body is experiencing. If your body is tense, your thoughts will follow that tension. If your breathing is shallow, your mind will feel unstable. If your posture collapses, your confidence will drop. This connection is constant and most people are completely unaware of it. They try to control the mind while the body is reinforcing the opposite state. This is why emotional control often feels inconsistent. You understand what to do mentally, but your body is already amplifying the reaction. And once that cycle begins, it becomes much harder to stabilize. But the moment you reverse the approach, everything changes. Instead of starting with thought, you start with the body. You slow your breathing deliberately, not randomly, but with control. You bring it deeper, steadier, more consistent. This signals to your nervous system that there is no immediate threat. You adjust your posture. You sit or stand upright, not rigid, but grounded. Your body communicates stability, and your mind begins to reflect that. You relax unnecessary tension, your shoulders, your jaw, your hands. These small adjustments reduce the physical intensity that feeds emotional reactions. Marcus Aurelius practiced this awareness when he reminded himself to maintain composure not only in thought, but in physical presence, understanding that internal stability is reflected outward and reinforced inward. This is not superficial. It is strategic. Because when your body is calm, your mind has a different foundation to operate from. The same situation that would have triggered you before now feels more manageable. Not because the situation changed, but because your internal state did, and this gives you an immediate advantage. Instead of fighting your emotions, you regulate the system that produces them. Over time, this becomes automatic. Your body begins to default to a more stable state, and your mind follows. You react less intensely, recover faster, and maintain clarity even under pressure. But there is another layer to this that goes beyond control. Because when your internal state becomes consistently stable, people begin to notice something without you saying a word. The way you carry yourself starts to influence how others respond to you, and that creates a form of authority that does not need to be asserted. The invisible authority of those who do not react. There is a type of power that does not announce itself. It does not need volume, confrontation, or constant expression. It is not built through dominance or control over others. It is built through something far more subtle and far more rare. Emotional stability in moments where most people would lose it. When someone does not react the way others expect, the entire dynamic changes. People are used to predictable patterns. They say something sharp. They expect a reaction. They provoke. They expect resistance. They apply pressure. They expect movement. And when none of that happens, when there is no immediate emotional response, something shifts in the perception of that person. They become harder to read, harder to influence, harder to control. This is where invisible authority begins to form. It is not about silence alone. It is about composure. It is about responding only when necessary, and doing so with clarity instead of impulse. It is about maintaining a steady presence regardless of what is happening around you. And people notice this even if they cannot explain it. Because most individuals are governed by their reactions. Their tone changes, their posture shifts, their energy fluctuates depending on the situation, and when they encounter someone who remains consistent, it creates contrast. That contrast creates respect. Not forced respect, not demanded respect, but a natural recognition that this person operates differently, that they are not easily affected, that they are grounded in a way that does not depend on external conditions. Seneca pointed toward this idea when he described the wise person as someone who remains equal to themselves in all circumstances, not elevated by praise, not diminished by criticism. This consistency is what separates reaction from control. And once you embody this, something else happens. You stop needing to prove yourself. You do not feel the urge to respond to every comment. You do not feel compelled to correct every misunderstanding. You do not engage in unnecessary conflict to defend your position, because your stability is no longer dependent on how others see you. And that removes a significant amount of pressure. At the same time, your responses become more precise. When you do speak, it carries weight. Not because you are louder, but because you are not speaking from reaction. You are speaking from intention. Marcus Aurelius reinforced this discipline in Meditations, Book 11, paragraph 18, where he emphasized that the best way to deal with difficult people is to remain grounded in your own character, not pulled into their behavior. This is not detachment from reality, it is mastery within it. And over time, this way of operating builds something deeper than momentary control. It builds identity, because when you consistently respond with clarity instead of reaction, you begin to see yourself differently. And that internal shift is what ultimately determines how much influence the external world has over you. Building an unshakable identity. At a certain point, control stops being a technique and becomes part of who you are. It is no longer something you try to apply in difficult moments. It becomes your default way of operating. And this shift only happens when you stop focusing on isolated reactions and start building a solid internal identity. Because without a clear sense of who you are, your emotional state will always be vulnerable to external influence. If your identity depends on being liked, criticism will shake you. If it depends on being right, disagreement will trigger you. If it depends on being respected, any perceived slight will feel like a threat. And in each case, your reactions are not just about the situation. They are about protecting an unstable version of yourself. This is why many people struggle to maintain control, even when they understand the principles. They are trying to regulate reactions without addressing the foundation those reactions are built on. An unshakable identity removes that instability. It is not built on external validation, outcomes, or other people's perceptions. It is built on internal standards, on clarity about how you choose to think, how you choose to act, and what you allow to affect you. This means you define your values before the situation tests them. You decide in advance that you will not react impulsively. You decide that you will not allow external behavior to dictate your internal state. You decide that your response will always align with who you choose to be, not with what is happening around you. Epictetus emphasized this when he taught that you should concern yourself only with what is within your control and build your life around that principle. When your identity is anchored in what you control, it becomes stable. When it is anchored in what you do not control, it becomes fragile. This is a structural shift. Instead of asking, "How should I react in this situation?" you begin to ask, "What kind of person am I regardless of the situation?" And that question changes everything. Because now, your behavior is not reactive. It is consistent. It is not shaped by circumstances. It is guided by principles. Over time, this consistency reinforces itself. Each moment of control strengthens your identity. Each decision to remain steady confirms who you are becoming. And eventually, reacting impulsively starts to feel out of character. That is when control becomes natural. Marcus Aurelius reflected this idea in Meditations, Book 7, paragraph 16, when he reminded himself to be like the person he wished to become, not occasionally, but constantly, not depending on circumstances, but regardless of them. This is the level where emotional independence is no longer fragile, because it is not something you are trying to maintain. It is something you have become. And once you reach this point, there is one final realization that changes how you see everything. The moment where control is no longer something you practice, but something that defines how you move through the world. The turning point, when nothing controls you anymore. There is a moment where everything clicks. Not because the world changes, not because people start behaving differently, but because you no longer respond the way you used to. The same situations happen, the same triggers appear, the same behaviors come from others, but something inside you is no longer available to be pulled. And that is the turning point. It is subtle at first. You notice that things that once disturbed you now pass without impact. Comments that would have stayed in your mind for hours no longer hold your attention. Situations that once triggered immediate reactions now feel distant, almost neutral. You are still aware. You still see what is happening, but you are no longer absorbed by it. This is not suppression. It is not indifference. It is control. Because now there is a clear separation between what happens outside and what happens inside. The connection that once felt automatic is no longer there. The space between stimulus and response is no longer something you try to create. It exists naturally, and in that space you are free. Free from the need to react, free from the urge to prove something, free from the constant pull of external validation, free from emotional patterns that once defined your behavior. Seneca described this state as inner freedom, a condition where a person is no longer enslaved by impulses or external circumstances. Not because life becomes easier, but because the individual becomes stronger than the forces that once influenced them. And this strength is quiet. It does not seek attention. It does not need recognition. It does not depend on outcomes. It simply exists as a stable foundation beneath everything you do. Marcus Aurelius pointed toward this idea in Meditations, Book 6, Paragraph 8, when he reminded himself that the mind, once disciplined, becomes a place of order regardless of external chaos. This is not a temporary state. It is a way of being. At this level, your presence changes. People may not understand exactly what is different, but they feel it. There is no urgency in you, no instability, no need to react to everything that happens. You move with intention. You speak with precision. You act without being driven by impulse, and most importantly, you are no longer easily controlled. Because control was never about stopping the world from affecting you. It was about removing the mechanisms inside you that allowed it to. Once those mechanisms are gone, or at least no longer dominant, everything becomes simpler. You stop overthinking. You stop replaying situations. You stop attaching meaning where none is needed. You stop giving your energy to what does not deserve it. And in that simplicity there is clarity. You see things as they are. You respond when it is necessary. You remain still when it is not. You choose your actions instead of being driven by them. This is the point where mastery becomes visible, not through effort but through consistency. And once you reach this state, one truth becomes undeniable. When no one can control your emotions, no one can control you.